One of the most famous buildings in the world, one designed by Lloyd Wright, is undergoing a massive facelift right now. Welcome to Architecture 360. I'm Lee Bay. Unity Temple, a remarkable structure located just west of Chicago, is being restored to the tune of $23 million. The church in the suburb of Oak Park is one of Wright's most important works, and to some, the right-angled concrete building is the world's first architecturally modern building. But for years, this building, known in history books the world over, has suffered under quiet and steady decay. Architect Gunny Harbaugh, president of Harbaugh Architects, is leading the efforts to bring back this Wright masterpiece, and he joins us now. Gunny, how are you?
I'm well, Lee. Thanks for having me on.
How important is this building?
In Wright's of many hundred buildings, I don't know how many hundred, several hundred buildings, this certainly ranks in the top group. In fact, it's one of 10 Lloyd Wright buildings that are under consideration right now as a serial nomination for World Heritage. And it's the oldest and the first on the list, frankly. So it was always thought by Wright to be one of his most important works. He wrote about that himself, that he considered this to be one of the most important things he did.
Now, many of us who are familiar with Wright's work know his Prairie School architecture, but this is a little different, isn't it? It's made of concrete, and tell us.
Concrete was a fairly new material at that time. It was used for warehouse structures and more utilitarian kind of buildings, and Wright employed it here as a cost-saving device to be able to create this building that he had in his mind. Brick was too expensive, so by using the formwork for reinforced concrete and being able to reuse it, he felt he could make a considerable cost savings to the client, which he did.
Now, the inside is one of the most spectacular places you'll see almost any place in the world, the sanctuary, the worship space. Talk about that a little bit.
It's a very moving space. Actually, it starts on the outside because you have this whole procession, which is very common to Wright, this sort of path of discovery, which he was very interested in doing. So you become heightened. Your awareness about the change of space and how you're experiencing the space is something that you are basically forced to withstand or to experience. And then you finally get into that sanctuary, and there's this release. He also has this device that he used called compression and release, where you get in a low space, as in the vestibule, and then actually when you make the procession into the sanctuary itself, there's a series of turns you make, and you go into a sort of small, cramped, darker area, and then boom, you come out into that beautiful light-filled space, and the light's coming from the top. There's a series of almost a grid of beautiful, very delicate art glass ley lights that sit and create the ceiling plane, and that, of course, is lit by a overall skylight. And then around the perimeter at the top of the wall, there are very large windows that are also art glass, almost all clear glass, but some very delicate kind of colored glass in there. So you have a very sharp contrast between this light-filled top, almost a halo at the top, and then it comes down through like you're sitting in a glen in the forest.
And it's quite a contrast if you think about churches of that era. A church built in 1909, 1900 or so may look like a piece of old Rome, right, or a cathedral in London. And this clearly is is past that and is sort of pointing toward the future in many respects.
Right. You're absolutely right. The previous church that burned down, which is why they built the church in the first place, it had burned down with a lightning strike, and that had been a more conventional type of church, and I think many people thought that's what they were going to get, but he had something different in mind. Wright knew that he really had made something special, and it was right after this, actually, that he left the United States. This is when he had taken off with one of his clients' wives, Mae McChaney, and there was such a scandal over that he had to basically leave town, and he did. In fact, they went to Europe, and this is when he created the Wasmuth portfolio, which was a very important document. Basically, it was his means to document all of his work to that point. The Prairie Houses, Roby House, Bradley House, the Willits House, many other of the Prairie houses that he did, and then some of the key other works, including Unity Temple, the Larkin Building, and some of these other things that he was doing at that time. And that document that got published in 1911 in Europe influenced modern architecture profoundly. It was not only something that the Europeans saw, but other Americans saw, and really was a way that he solidified his reputation as one of the primary founders of what we think of as modern architecture.
Now, tell us about the condition of the building that made this work necessary.
Today, or the reason that this project really had to happen, was that there was a lot of deterioration to the roof structure. There's a lot of deterioration to the some of the walls, the parapets, the area around the chimney, and so on, where this concrete is beginning to spall off in significant areas, and that also has caused problems on the inside.
Now, if you go down Lake Street in Oak Park now and past the building, it's quite the sight. It's wrapped, it's shrouded in this sort of covering. It looks like Christo got hold of it, but beneath it, obviously, there's work going on. Tell us what's happening right now.
So the building is undergoing a complete inside and outside restoration, and it involves basically every surface inside and outside. It also involves, and I'll get back to that in a second, but it also involves the installation of a geothermal heating system. So we're upgrading it now to the modern technology, which should allow the congregation to have the assurance of having both heating and cooling. It never did have cooling previously, so this will allow them to have it be cooler in the summertime. It can be quite uncomfortable there, frankly, in the summertime. That's one modern technology that we're taking advantage of. But basically, there's two major efforts. One is the outside, where all the surfaces of the concrete are being restored, and that's probably the most difficult thing, is to match the new material to the existing material.
How do you do that?
Well, with a lot of trial and error. We've been working on it for, as I said, 15 years, but this particular phase, we spent a good part of last summer doing a lot of mock-ups and trials to try to see what is the proper mix of the little stones, the aggregate, and the cement, because the color of the cement can affect the overall look of it. The inside of the building is a totally different story. That was a case where Wright was using sand plaster, where the sand of the plaster is actually intended to read through a very thin color, almost like a wash, but it is a paint, an oil-based paint, but it's almost as thin as turpentine.
Wow.
So the plaster is applied, and the texture of the plaster, the color of the plaster, the sand in the plaster, all that stuff makes a big difference in what you get as a visual effect. And then the paint is applied, it's wiped off, and it settles very subtly in the sort of valleys, if you will, of the surface of the plaster. And so you get this beautiful and very delicate visual texture of the wall that changes depending on the light and depending on the time of day. And that has been missing for a very long time, because I don't know what year, but there are many, many coats of paint. So not only did you lose the texture of the plaster, but you lost this very soft visual quality of what the wall will bring. I think that is going to be an extreme revelation when people see it in its restored state.
Why go through all this trouble? Some of the things you're talking about, most people won't see or notice. Why do this?
This is one of the most important buildings, I think, in the world, certainly as it relates to modern architecture. The materiality of it is important because we want to be as authentic about the restoration as we possibly can be. With the pending World Heritage nomination, we are thinking of this, in a world context, and we're looking at it with those kinds of ideas about what does it mean to have an important building of this significance, and with that question of material authenticity. This is something that's gets rather nerdy, I have to admit, but nonetheless, amongst conservation professionals worldwide, this becomes a very important issue, and one that we take very seriously and want to make sure that we are addressing fully.
Now, you've done some amazing work around town. I wouldn't even know where to begin list-wise. Former Carson Perry Scott building downtown on State Street is one. Talk about that, and also the idea that you're an architect and scientist and detective. I mean, there's a lot of all that going on when you do this kind of thing. Yeah,
well, the Carson's building, which is now known as the Sullivan Center, that was also a very interesting challenge. There the original cornice had been removed around 1948, and this was a very complicated project that Joseph Fried Associates took on. They got some very generous TIF funding from the city of Chicago to help them both to put the cornice back on, and then following that, there was a secondary project to restore the two-story cast iron storefront there that was hanging on literally by a thread in some cases, I would say. And that also involved a lot of detective work. I mean, the hours that we spent studying fuzzy photographs to try to reconstruct that cornice was quite amazing. And we worked with Tim Samuelson quite closely, Tim Samuelson being the cultural historian for the city of Chicago and one of the leading experts in the world on Sullivan and Wright. Worked very closely with him to try to get the sense of what that cornice ought to be like. And then, of course, always serendipity plays a role. We found a photograph of an element that had long been missing, but allowed us to very accurately replicate the capitals of the loggia that we reproduced up there. The cast iron storefront itself, that was a case of not so much detective work, but really a meticulous disassembly and restoration and then reassembly of that there. And there are literally thousands of pieces of metal that had to be all reassembled. We dry fit everything. We did the scientific analysis of the finishes. There was a very complicated story there that we don't have time for, but nonetheless we got that all correct.
Now, I should also mention that you are a member, I think you still are a member of Docomomo. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Docomomo is a funny name that stands for the Documentation and Conservation of Building Sites and Neighborhoods of the Modern Movement, so Docomomo.
Gotcha.
And it was started in the late 1980s by a couple of Dutch architects that were lamenting the loss of the beautiful early work of some of the great early modernists in Holland. And that spread. It's actually 20 years ago that Docomomo US was founded right here in Chicago. Many, many people now are more interested in preserving this really important part of our cultural heritage. The 20th century is now of the past, so we want to make sure that we're preserving that for the future.
How do you think we're doing locally in Chicago?
Well, I think it's pretty mixed in Chicago. I think it's great that there's some important buildings that have been landmark. Crown Hall, of course, down at IIT is a city landmark, as well as the Inland Steel Building and the Daly Center by Jacques Bronson. Those are all landmarks. But I think the recent loss of Prentice Hospital, of course, that was a very hard-fought battle, and then they decided it was a landmark, and then, oh, by the way, you can still tear it down. That sets a very bad precedent. Mm-hmm. As well as the announced pending demolition of Malcolm X College, one of Gene Summers' best buildings, and Gene Summers, who was one of Mises' best pupils and workers, and he went on to do some great buildings, including the McCormick One, or the Lakeside building. That's also some people have their eyes on to remove, which would be unfortunate, I think. We still lose a lot. I mean, there's been a number of Paul Rudolph buildings torn down out east. He was an incredibly important architect, and then there are these brutalist buildings that are very difficult to love, and Prentice would fall in that category. But again, it's beyond just wanting to hug the building. You need to understand what the building means in the bigger cultural context.
So there's that risk that you do when you do this, is that the generation behind you will know you tore down something splendid.
There is a generational issue there. And one of the National Register, which sort of sets the trend, or at least the parameters for how we think about what is a important building, they have sort of the unwritten 50-year rule. If it's less than 50 years old, it has to demonstrate exceptional significance. So in other words, it has a sort of a higher threshold. And that 50-year rule, and there are many municipalities actually that have adopted similar things. In Chicago, it's not hard and fast that way, but there are other places where it is. That's because there was a feeling that when that was created in the 70s, 60s, 70s, that there needed to be that much time to elapse for you to really understand it. But of course, the way we live now, the accelerator on the pedal is pushed to the floor, And Time Accelerator is crazy with all the way that we have of our experiences in life and the internet. All that stuff adds to that. And I don't think you can judge these things in the same kind of time context that we have previously.
Speaking of time, how about Unity Temple? When might the work be completed?
Well, right now the schedule is to be completed by late fall next year, 2016. And I think that's very achievable.
Architect Gunny Harbaugh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
And I'm Lee Bay. Thank you for listening to Architecture 360. Join me next time.